Ward Francis Weaver III was born on April 6, 1963, in Humboldt County, California, to Trish Weaver and Ward Weaver Jr. When Weaver was just 4 years old, his mother Trish decided to leave his father, citing a disorderly and unhappy marriage. Ward Jr. would keep in contact with his children, Ward III, and his two sisters, Teresa and Tammy. But soon after his parents separated, Ward Jr. would be drafted into the Army and shipped off to Vietnam. Trish Weaver would move on shortly after her separation from Ward Jr., meeting Bob Budrow at a hotel bar in Eureka, California in 1967. It's known that he was a bit of a bar brawler and was quite the drinker, keeping several tabs open at various pubs around the area. Trish's second marriage with Bob wasn't much better than her first one. Budrow frequented the bars so much that Trish would have to make a bed for young Ward and his sisters in the back seat of their car, as they would sleep back there while Trish would drive around town from bar to bar, looking for Bob, who was often out late at night drinking. Bob Budrow was an abusive man and would often beat Ward and his sisters, so they were usually relieved on the nights that Trish wasn't able to find him and he would stay out all night drinking. In the early 70s, Trish and Budrow would add to the family with a son named Robert. Budrow then found work as a longshoreman up the 101 in North Bend, Oregon. Here he would continue to run tabs up at local bars, where Trish would then have to work as a waitress to help pay down, resulting in the family living in subsidized housing and constantly being short on finances. In 1975, Budrow would take Ward with him on a job to Sacramento, California. After a few weeks, one of Budrow's co-workers would call Trish and let her know that Ward was being left alone in the motel room for long periods of time, while Budrow was getting drunk at the bars. Trish demanded that her husband and her son come back home immediately. When Budrow pulled into the driveway, a 12-year-old, red-haired, freckle-faced Ward would hop out of the truck, slam the door, and give his mom a nasty glare. Trish stated that Ward stayed mad at her for years for sending him down to Sacramento with Budrow. "That's the day I lost my son," she said. Trish claims that Budrow is to blame for much of her son's misery, and she thinks that something happened on that trip to Sacramento that triggered her son's rage. Ward was never the same. The family moved to Portland, Oregon in the late 70s. It was at this point where Ward's behavior would continue to worsen, as he would constantly torment his younger half-brother Robert. Ward would stand his younger brother Robert in front of a tree in their backyard and use a dog chain to wrap around him so that he was fastened to the tree and couldn't move. Ward would also hold Robert's face within inches of the neighbor's fence and laugh hysterically as the neighbor's dog would jump into the fence and bark at Robert, frightening the poor young boy. Ward's younger sister Tammy also can recant her brother's cruelty as a teenager. Tammy has stated that she actually doesn't remember a time where her older brother wasn't hurting her in some shape or form. He got a thrill out of shooting her in the back multiple times with his BB gun. Tammy would go on to spend many years in therapy as a result of the abuse she endured as a child, and has cut off contact with almost all of her family members, stating that "we were never a family. We were 6 people growing up in the same house, in a very violent house. Ward has put me through so much hell. For years after I left, I had nightmares about him." Ward would go on to graduate 6 months early from Marshall High School. He then got a job as a cook at a Portland restaurant where he flipped burgers, still living at home, and making his commute to and from work via bicycle. Weaver would have his first run-in with the law just before his 18th birthday. In April of 1981, a relative accused him of sexually assaulting her. Police interviewed him and the girl, but according to a Multnomah County juvenile court, police decided not to press charges, as Weaver had enlisted in the U.S. Navy Reserve 2 months prior and would soon be shipped out. About the same time that Ward was making his first mark as a criminal, his father, Ward Weaver Jr., would showcase his violent ways as well. On February 5th, 1981, a couple by the name of Robert Radford and Barbara Lavoie would make an unassuming yet fatal mistake. The couple were on a road trip heading to Las Vegas when their vehicle broke down outside of Tehachapi, California. Ward Weaver Jr. was a semi-truck driver, and the young couple were in need of a lift. As Ward Jr. was passing by on Highway 58, he offered the couple a ride to the nearest town. They would never be seen alive again. Weaver Jr. would ask Radford to help him with something in the back of his truck when he struck him in the back of the head with a metal bar, killing the 18-year-old. He then kidnapped 23-year-old Barbara Lavoie, sexually assaulted her, and then brought her back to his home in Oroville, California, where he tied her to a tree. He had planned to take her with him on his next trip, but when Lavoie bit Ward Jr.'s finger, he became enraged, so he strangled her and buried her in his backyard. It is believed that these aren't the only murders that Ward Jr. committed. Prosecutors matched his semi-truck logs with more than 24 unsolved homicides up and down the West Coast, and when trying to make a deal to avoid the death penalty, Weaver Jr. told prosecutors he would lead them to the bodies of 26 other victims in exchange for life in prison. They declined, and he was sentenced to death. The Weaver family had an extreme history of violence, and it didn't start with Ward's father, Ward Jr. It started with Ward's grandfather, Ward Weaver Sr. Ward Sr. would sexually assault his own wife, Dorothy, along with other women that he would bring home after Dorothy refused to sleep with him. It's alleged that Ward Weaver Sr. would sexually assault his own daughter, as well as his granddaughters, Ward's sisters, Tammy and Teresa. Absolute violence, anger, and abuse were deeply seated into the roots of the Weaver family tree. Ward III would ship off to the Navy in 1981, receiving no charges for the assault of his relative. While in the Navy, he would meet Maria Stout, whom he would later marry. But he was soon discharged on May 17, 1982, for excessive drinking and overall neglect of his naval duties. Weaver would move back to Portland with Maria, where they discovered that she was pregnant with their first child. While she was 5 months pregnant, Ward was arrested for assaulting Maria, but she would refuse to cooperate with law enforcement. In December of 1982, Maria gave birth to their son, Francis Paul Weaver. Ward and Maria would then move to Bakersfield, California in 1984, where they would get married and give birth to a second son, Alex. 2 years would pass before Weaver's violent ways would surface yet again. On June 15, 1986, a 23-year-old Weaver would spend a night out drinking and getting high on speed after fighting with his wife Maria. In need of a ride home, Weaver was picked up outside of a bowling alley in Fairfield by Jennifer and Jocelyn Ordona, whose parents were friends with Ward and Maria, and would often babysit for the Weaver family. Shortly after the girls picked up Weaver, he asked if they could pull over so that he could relieve himself. Moments later, Weaver flung open the passenger door and struck 15-year-old Jocelyn in the head with a piece of cement, knocking her out immediately. He then attacked 16-year-old Jennifer, who was in the driver's seat. Jennifer struggled to break free, screaming, "Ward, what are you doing? It's me, Jennifer." Weaver was sentenced to 3 years in prison for this violent attack, but was released only a year and a half later in January of 1988. After being released, Ward and Maria left California and moved to Canby, Oregon. They briefly operated a gift shop, and in 1989, Maria gave birth to their third child, a daughter, Mallory Weaver. By 1993, Weaver was involved in selling cocaine and methamphetamine, which prompted his wife Maria to file a restraining order and end their marriage. Soon after, 31-year-old Weaver started dating 18-year-old Christy Sloan. Weaver was jailed yet again in 1994 for beating Christy with a cast-iron skillet in their Portland apartment, but the charges were dropped after Sloan refused to testify against Weaver, stating that she feared Weaver so much that she was concerned for her own safety if she testified. Things were quiet for Weaver over the next few years, and in 1997, he would move into a home on South Beaver Creek Road in Oregon City. This home would be the setting for what's to come next, and Ward Weaver III would finally be seen for what a gruesome individual he truly is. 12-year-old Ashley Pond lived at the Newell Creek Apartments with her family. The apartment complex housed numerous single mothers trying to make ends meet and raise their children. This complex was also home to Miranda Gaddis, who lived with her mother and 9-year-old sister. Ashley and Miranda were good friends with Weaver's 12-year-old daughter, Mallory, and they often hung out at the Weaver household, which sat on the corner of Beaver Creek Road, just around the corner from the apartment complex where the girls lived. The girls all had a great relationship with each other and were very comfortable with the Weaver household, even looking up to Ward as a sort of father figure. But that would all change in August of 2001, when Ashley accused Weaver of sexually assaulting her. Unfortunately, the police did not investigate this claim. On the morning of January 9th, 2002, Ashley left for school and headed up to the bus stop. The school bus came and went, but Ashley was nowhere to be seen. She had seemingly vanished. There was a lot of speculation in the first couple of days. Ashley's home life was not the greatest, and many believed that she may have ran away. But after a week had passed and still no word on Ashley's whereabouts, people began to fear for the worst. There was no crime scene or any evidence that an abduction had occurred. She had simply vanished. Friends, family, and search crews looked for Ashley day in and day out without a trace. And on March 8th, Miranda Gaddis would suffer the same fate. She woke up that morning, got ready for school, left for the bus stop at 7:30 a.m., and was never seen again. After Miranda went missing, Clackamas County Deputy DA Christine Landers, who had been working the Ashley Pond disappearance since day one, had immediately suspected that they were most likely dealing with a pair of homicides. And since the two girls were good friends with each other, lived in the same complex, and disappeared under the same exact circumstance, they concluded that the girls were most likely abducted by the same person. With virtually no forensic evidence and no eyewitnesses, they started digging deep for answers, looking into anyone that could possibly be involved in the girls' disappearance, and one person that stood out that both of the girls knew was Ward Weaver III. His house sat at the top of the driveway leading down to the girls' apartments, and since the girls were friends with Weaver's daughter, Mallory, and frequented the home, this stood out to detectives. 3 months would pass, and in June, a source close to the Pond family would reveal to a local reporter that they believe the girls may have been kidnapped by Weaver. The local task force begins digging into Weaver's past, and he quickly becomes their main suspect in the girls' disappearance. Weaver's criminal history and violent past only further solidifies him as their primary suspect. Investigators even believe that he may have a possible motive after discovering that Ashley Pond had accused Weaver of sexually assaulting her back in August. But even after taking all of that into account, it still didn't provide officials with enough evidence to obtain a search warrant. After Weaver's past had become known to the community thanks to a local reporter, the media went on a frenzy, interviewing Weaver every chance they could get. People in the community began to suspect Weaver was their guy, and that he had buried the girls somewhere on his property. Investigators are just as focused on Weaver and the possibility that the girls may in fact be buried somewhere on the property, but they are still not able to obtain a search warrant. One of the largest points of interest was a concrete pad that Weaver had poured recently in his backyard, claiming it was the foundation for a hot tub. Many believed it was a burial ground. The immense speculation from the community was starting to take its toll on Weaver. By late summer, he had quit his job and began packing up his belongings, getting ready to leave town. On August 13, 2002, Weaver's 20-year-old son Francis and his girlfriend Randy spent the day helping his father pack. That evening, Weaver was all packed up and ready to go, and then he snapped. After spending the day helping pack, Randy decided to take a shower. Only moments later, Weaver would barge into the bathroom and attack Randy, pulling her out of the shower, trying to strangle and sexually assault her. Somehow, Randy managed to escape. Wrapped in only a shower curtain, she fled the house and flagged down a passing motorist. Weaver tried to make a run for it, but moments later, police had surrounded his car and made the arrest. This incident would prove to be a big help for the case. Because of Weaver's actions that night, the task force finally had probable cause to obtain a search warrant for the home. On August 23, 2002, they obtained a warrant to search for Ashley and Miranda's bodies. After a full day of searching the property, the first set of remains are found. Miranda Gaddis is located inside of a small cardboard box inside of the shed. A media circus ensues after the first body is found. They look on for 2 days as the task force searches every inch of the property. Ashley Pond is missing for almost 8 months when she is finally found, buried underneath the concrete pad in the backyard. She was located inside of a 55-gallon drum that was placed underneath the pad. The search for Miranda and Ashley is finally over. Weaver is indicted on 17 charges, including the attack on his son's girlfriend and the sexual assault of Ashley when she was still alive. And although the bodies of Ashley and Miranda were found on Weaver's property, one of which was buried under a concrete slab that he poured, it was far from an open and shut case, as there wasn't any real evidence tying him directly to the murders. Weaver maintains his innocence and enters a plea of not guilty on October 4, 2002. He speaks to a number of reporters while awaiting trial, protesting his self-proclaimed innocence. Prosecutors were aiming for the death penalty, and there were a number of things that delayed the case from going to trial. 2 years after Ashley and Miranda's disappearance, their families were still waiting for justice. On August 25, 2004, Weaver appears in court, finally ready to stand trial, which was set for January of 2005. But before trial can begin, in September of 2004, Weaver has his lawyers approach the DA, now wanting to enter a plea of guilty and avoid going to trial, and ultimately avoid the death penalty. His daughter Mallory wrote to him in jail, convincing him to not go to trial so that she didn't have to testify against him. They agree to the deal, and on September 22, 2004, Ward Weaver pleads guilty to aggravated murder. He is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.